good things. First, by increasing the cost of fossil fuel generated power, it will cause people to economize on their use. Thus,
Ah, see, that is what everybody would like to think, Mr. Asimov. Um, I certainly thought that for some time. Um, well, let me say that I was at least willing to believe it might be true for some time. Um, when was it, around 2007 or so? A carbon tax was introduced in British Columbia, um, which is a large province in the west side of Canada. And I remember paying quite close attention to it to see if it would actually have the effect of reducing the amount of carbon that people spent. And it seemed to me that in fact most people didn't understand. Um, People got angry that they were being taxed, and they just thought that the more that they used it, the more money would go to the people collecting the tax. The idea that it might reduce the amount of energy that they use seems to have really never even crossed their mind. I remember having conversations with people that had decided that they would have to pull their kids at hockey in order to pay for their SUV. It never crossed their mind to replace their SUV with a smaller car. Instead, they cut back on other things, right? And then when you look at the ripple effect of that, you end up with a negative, with a really serious problem. So if instead of spending less on, okay, so let's say you have a family of four, the statistical average, and it's probably not the statistical average anymore, but it was. Let's say it's a family of four, and they go out for supper together twice a week. It's routine, If they get hit with a carbon tax, what's going to happen is that they're not going to spend less on transportation. Like they're not going to take the bus to work. They're not going to downsize their car. What they're going to do is they're going to go out for supper less, and so then there's less money floating around in the local economy, um, and that's recessionary. Um, so I mean, it would be great if this idea actually would work, but it seems to be that the evidence that I've seen, and I think maybe maybe a closer, think through the process, suggests that increasing taxes does not reduce consumption. It acts more like a sin tax. That's really more what a carbon tax is. This whole Pagovian thing doesn't really seem to work out. What seems to work out is more along the idea of a sin tax. So, like a tax on cigarettes or a tax on, gambling. You don't reduce the activity so much as you just make people pay for it. On some level, I would be okay with that, except for that because energy is so key to everything else around us, there is really no way that a carbon tax can do anything except um, uh, create recessions. And that's really all you'll ever see out of it. Now, the theory suggests that the government will offset this by redistributing funds that it collects. But, I mean, if you really think about this for a second, at best it becomes just the best. If you're able to offset the recessionary aspect of this tax through redistributing, all you're doing is wasting resources on it because you're not actually reducing consumption, right? So you could argue, well, why don't you hit producers with the tax instead, and then that'll force them to, innovate and find new um, ways to generate things. But that doesn't happen either. And the reason is because they're already doing things the cheapest that they possibly can. I mean, they already have a profit motive. I mean, this idea that you need to incentivize firms to save money is really missing the plot, isn't it? So what ends up happening when you levy the tax is you're just increasing the price. It would be great if it worked. Don't get me wrong. It's just the economics don't seem to work. And well, when I'm pointing this out, is I'm pointing out that I'm pointing out failures in market theory. Okay, and what I'm suggesting is that the way to approach climate change is not using market theory. The way to reduce emissions is not using, this old economic theory that has really not helped us at all. The more time has gone on, the worse it has appeared. It's really not a good way to model human behavior because humans are simply not rational creatures. Or, if you want to give us a little bit of credit, you could say that, what it is that we call rational is not objective, right? So you're saying that it's objectively rational that you'll use less fuel, but like I say, if you actually talk to people, what you'll find out is they'll economize in other ways. Like they'll go out for supper less, or they'll take their kids out of hockey, or they'll buy less coffee. Like these other things that they'll do to offset the costs of the higher fuel prices. Partly because the centrality of it makes it so that they can't, and partly because they don't want to. Okay? Would they rather take their kids out of hockey or sell their SUV? You can call them names if you want, but the truth is that they'd rather take their kids out of hockey because, the SUV is the status symbol, and, their kids can mow the lawn instead. I mean, it's the reality of it, okay? So you're not getting to what you want. How do you do this then? Well, maybe instead of being concerned about conserving energy, we should be concerned about generating it cleanly. Okay? So, I think the government in Ontario actually had the right idea about this, which is that instead of levying taxes, what you do is you increase capacity. You increase generating capacity and then you socialize it so that the costs come down. So they did the first half of it. They invested a lot of money into generating clean energy capacity, and now at this point in Canada, we have enough generating capacity that we could run an electric car grid. We throw away billions of dollars of electricity every day. I don't know if those numbers are right, but billions every day sounds like a lot. But we throw a lot away every day. Like I think it's actually accurate to say that we're talking about billions of watts that are discarded. Our generating capacity far exceeds our demand, and we're selling it at a loss. But we can't get people to buy the cars, right? So in that sense, we have solved this issue. It's just a question of getting people to actually, pull their heads out of their asses and do the right thing. Instead, again, we have the same problem. Instead of adjusting to a new system, people want to hold on to old technology and they complain that they're overpaying for it. Like they're not able to understand the incentives that are created, or to understand the reasons why it's good to get off of carbon and move to cleaner technologies. They want to resist things because people are not fundamentally rational; they're fundamentally conservative, and that fundamental conservatism leads to very strong concepts of irrationality. Instead of doing the things, instead of making the changes and adapting to things, okay, humans tend to dig in their heels and hold on to things that don't make sense because they don't like things to change. But nonetheless, that is the better approach. Carbon taxes are never going to get anything anywhere. What needs to happen is the governments need to step up um, and spend lavishly on generating new electricity. Build solar uh, facilities, build wind facilities, build electric dams, just generate huge amounts of electricity, and then throw in incentives for people to buy, electric cars, and use the grid. Um, raising a tax and then letting the market take care of it is never going to work because all you're doing is incentivizing cost increases. You're just making things more expensive. You're not actually instituting change. If you want things to actually change, you have to actually do it. Okay, not like try to incentivize people towards some chain of logic that you've abstractly suggested ought to be the way that you know. It's you're projecting your fantasies onto reality. It's anti-empirical, um, and maybe that's the better takeaway from the failure of carbon taxation. Both the failure of it to be accepted and the failure of it in implementation. The places that have implemented carbon taxes have not seen decreases at all. Or if they have, then those decreases are attributed to something else. Maybe the takeaway is that it's just another example of trying to start with a theory and apply and push a theory down into reality rather than starting with a reality and adjusting to it empirically. Maybe it's just another example of this backwards kind of philosophy that it had really it's maybe a little disappointing to hear Isaac Asimov be the spokesperson for this because in a lot of ways he was at the tail end of a movement that was supposed to be about jettisoning this kind of thinking. And it certainly has crept back in over the last 100 years. But it's not any less wrong than it was before, and it's not any less necessary to throw away than it ever was before. We can't come up with solutions by coming up with theories and then trying to force reality to adhere to our theories. We have to study how things are and adjust to the world as it is. And what that means is not carbon taxes, but direct investment into huge amounts of infrastructure. And how do you pay for it? I don't care. Tax the hockey players. That would be probably my best idea. Put a 35% tax on hockey players. I don't care. Raise corporate taxes. It's what's really more important is just getting your head around the idea that markets do not solve problems. People have to solve problems by coming together and actually doing things. And the best tool that we have to do that at this moment, unfortunately, is the state. Such is the truth of things. So that's my take on this. Like I say, I have supported political movements for carbon taxes in the past, maybe a little bit skeptically, but out of desperation, you might say, to have something actually work itself through. It just the world just seemed full of selfish assholes that really didn't want to do the right thing. And when faced with such a humongous hurdle, it was very tempting to want to be a little bit more aggressive. But I can see now that this is ham-fisted, that there's really no connection that really makes sense between levying carbon taxes and reducing emissions, and that mindset is really just another symptom, and the results that we're seeing are just another example of the failure of market theory to explain the economy, and the necessity to move beyond market economics to build a better, freer society. So sorry, Isaac, you're totally wrong on this one. So I just want to add, so what's a concrete reaction in terms of tax policy? What's a better idea than a carbon tax? A better idea than a carbon tax may be a tax on cars, right? So when you buy a car, you are forced to pay a tax for purchasing that technology, or equivalently, and maybe better, would be a tax cut for electric vehicles, right? So instead of saying that every time you go to the gas pump you got to pay money, for your sin of using gas, it would be better to say, okay, when you're making a decision as to what technology you're going to purchase, we're going to make you pay more for a carbon technology than for an electric technology. So that would work the same way for like furnaces, for example, right? So it would be a good idea to levy a high tax on gas furnaces, and a tax cut on electric heating, because one is dirty and the other one is clean, right? So that would make more sense than this consumption tax that is just going to force people to spend less money in other ways rather than actually reduce their consumption. That consumption is required. I mean, nobody wants to go back in time, right? Nobody wants to go back to before the industrial era. That's not, well, very few people. I've met a few, of these like primitivist anarchists, and you don't even want to bother talking to them. They're crazy. Like they talk about like mass depopulation, and it's scary stuff, right? Which is not to say that it wouldn't be a good idea to get our population growth curve down a little bit, but like they want to, like they're talking about 100 million people on the earth, and that's what they would need for their system to work. So like do you want to gas them or do you want to electrocute them? Like, how do you get rid of 6-7 billion people? It's crazy, right? So I mean, nobody wants to go back in time. Building capacity for clean generation is not science fiction. It's not something in one of his books, okay? It's entirely feasible. In fact, as I mentioned, it exists here in Ontario. If we can do it, anybody else can do it. Or at least we can sell it to you. It's just a question of putting in place the proper economic incentives, not to approach it at the consumption stage, but to approach it at the technological aspect stage as to what it is that you're purchasing. So you want to incentivize people to, upgrade the heating systems in their home, to buy electric vehicles when they buy new vehicles, and these sorts of things, so that they're not forced with this decision at the pump, and they're not forced with this sin tax scenario, because it's not going to work out the way that the Homo economicus model wants it to. You're going to see people save money in other kinds of ways, or in our society, let's be frank, you're going to see people go into debt, because that's what people do in our society.